A reason why a person might believe the Bible is full of contradictions is because they might just think that there are too many translations of the Bible. And there are a lot of translations. Does anyone want to guess how many translations in English alone of the Bible there are? Genghis.
Like 427?
I don't actually know, but that's probably in the ballpark. I was wondering if any of you knew. I wasn't going to count. But there are a lot. There are at least a few hundred translations of the Bible. So for someone who goes to church on a regular basis, myself, who's read through the Bible, I know that a lot of the translations, they all pretty much have the same general idea. We're going to talk about that more in a couple minutes. But when I worked as a car salesman, I worked with a guy who told me that he didn't think that the Bible lined up. He asked me, he said, how come there are so many different translations of the Bible? And if there are so many different translations, then how do you know which Bible is true? And I thought that's a very valid question. If you don't go to church and you're not very familiar, but there's a King James, there's an NIV, whatever that stands for, there's an ESV, there's an NIRV, there's an ASB, there's all these different abbreviations. So I thought that was a really good question. He said, why are there so many translations and how do you know which translation is true? And we're going to put pause on that real quick. Mark, can you hand out those papers that I gave you? So if you have ever wondered why there are so many translations of the Bible, you are definitely not alone. I've wondered that as a student. I've wondered that as a young adult until I was able to learn more about it. While Mark hands out these papers, there are a couple of reasons for this. There's a couple of reasons why there's a lot of translations of the Bible in English. Number one, the most important is that the Bible was not originally written in English. It was written in other languages. Does anyone know what languages the Bible was originally written in? Hebrew. Good job, Blaine. Hebrew for most of the Old Testament. Absolutely. What was the other language used in the Old Testament? Does anyone know? Genghis, again.
Arabic.
Close. Aramaic. I know. Aramaic. Very close. Does anyone know what language the New Testament was written in? Blaine. Not? The Romans would have spoken this language. Matthias. Greek, yes, good job. So the Romans would have spoken Greek for sure. Blaine, so the Bible was written in Hebrew, it was written in Aramaic, and it was written in Greek. It was not written in English. I know, that's so mind-blowing, but that's very important because the Bible then has to be translated not just from one language, but from 3 different languages, and it has to be translated into English. Now I want you to think about your biggest textbook in school. Picture, your day-to-day classes. What is your biggest textbook? Everett, what's your biggest textbook? History? Okay. Jenny?
Probably history too.
History as well? Okay, interesting. Silas?
My dictionary.
Your dictionary? You have to carry a dictionary around with you?
It's like this thing.
That's painful. Okay, so think about your biggest textbook and all of the information in there. Now I want you to think about trying to translate that into another language, something hard like German. Think about the challenge that would be. You not only have to translate the words, right, word for word, but you also have to try to convey the meaning behind these words into this other language that it was not written into. That is not going to be an easy process. Translation is not an easy process. So as you can see on the papers that Mark handed out, the Bible translations are pretty much broken up into one of 3 groupings. They are either a word-for-word translation of the Bible, they are a thought-for-thought translation of the Bible, and there are some, it's not very common, they're not usually used, but there can also be a paraphrase translation, if you will, of the Bible. Now we're going to look at one verse in all 3 of these groupings. We're going to look at a verse, Romans 12:2. In ESV, a word-for-word translation, it says this: "Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what the will of God is, what is good and acceptable and perfect." And so in this word-for-word translation, the ESV is keeping in English the literal phrases from Greek, like conformed to the pattern of this world. And that's a very formal way to put it, right? Like no one's going to say, you're conforming to the pattern of this world. That's just kind of weird. So it's a little more formal or complex. Next, the NLT. This is a thought-for-thought translation of the Bible. And it says, for the same verse, don't copy the behavior and customs of this world, but let God transform you into a new person by changing the way you think. Then you will learn how to know God's will for you, which is good and pleasing and perfect. So a translation like this, a thought-for-thought translation, is less focused on making sure that the same words are retained in English, but making sure that the thought is communicated in English, making verses, a little more clear, a little more easier to understand for the regular reader like you and I. They're not going to throw in things like conform to the pattern of this world. Did you have a question?
I just noticed that it had the don't instead of do not.
There you go. Did not notice that. Good job. All right, if you're still with me, say, huh? Huh? If you're still paying attention, say, huh? Okay, I don't want to lose you guys in this. So word for word, a little more formal, a little more true to the original language, thought for thought. It's a little bit easier to understand for the regular reader like you and I. God bless you.
You said that's as far as
All right, so that's two groups. One more group of Bibles in English, the paraphrase. And we see here, this is the message, a paraphrase version of the Bible. It says, don't become so well adjusted to the culture that you fit into it without even thinking. Instead, fix your attention on God. You will be changed from the inside out. Readily recognize what he wants from you and quickly respond to it. Unlike the culture around you, always dragging you down to its level of immaturity, God brings out the best in you and develops well-formed maturity in you. Oh, it doesn't have all that? Yeah, I just split it up into two slides. It's the same verse that we just read, but it's like twice as long. So those Bibles, it'd be like the size of the dictionary that you have to carry around with you. The paraphrase, they're throwing in all these words. So that's very different, right? It's very simple. It might be a very easy concept to understand, but the spiritual depth in a paraphrase version of the Bible, spiritual depth is quickly getting lost, right? It's quickly getting lost because it's like too casual. It's not too formal, but it's getting too casual. So I would say if you're reading a paraphrase version of the Bible, that's okay. It's good to read the Bible to know what it says, but I would not stay in a paraphrase version of the Bible for very long. I would look at deciding for yourself. Do you think that word for word version of the Bible fits better for yourself and your personality, or does the thought for thought work a little bit better for you, a little bit easier to understand? So back to my friend at the car dealership, I told him when he asked me, I said, well, there are a lot of translations for the Bible. That's true. And I told him, some focus on the word for word, some focus on thought for thought. I used the translation analogy of trying to translate a book and how that would be difficult going from one language to another. Never mind 3 languages into one language. The sentence structure might be different in some Bibles, some translations, but the overall core meaning of the verses doesn't really get lost in one translation to another. So it's good. It's actually a good thing to read the same chapters in the Bible using different translations. It can help you get a fuller picture of what God's word really says, what the meaning behind a passage really is. So with my friend, nothing crazy happened. I didn't lead him to the Lord, and his whole life was completely different. We just had a conversation, and it gave him something to think about.